Okay, I've drank the last of my coffee now, I think. And one thing that I'm kind of jumping ahead to a different video right now, but I'm gonna make a point there to tie these two videos together, and that's before I went to grad school, before I did my PhD, I would watch this TV series about what it took to climb Mount Everest. And so I've got a picture of Mount Everest here. And one of the things that I found interesting, that I want to talk about momentarily, is how you don't just show up at Mount Everest and like a week later you go up and you come down and it's over with. You spend a lot of money and you probably stay for about a month. And what you end up doing for the first 3 weeks or so is you do a lot of climbing on the mountain, but you don't go to the top. You get familiar with the ropes, you get familiar with the conditions, you acclimate to this new hostile environment. And you need to allow your body and your mind to be ready for reaching the top. That's a good explanation for how grad school works. There's going to be a lot of repetition. There's going to be a lot of new ideas. There's going to be things unexpected. You're going to learn new tools. You're going to learn to work with new people. And ultimately, it's not to get to the top of the mountain, it's to get to the top and back down again. That's a metaphor that I often use for grad school is a lot of people can reach the top, but a lot of people die on the way down on Mount Everest. A lot of people don't even reach the top. So this key to success is figuring out how do I get to the top and back down again. And that is something I'll kind of discuss in more detail in another video. But I wanted to introduce that idea now because research will seem like it's a lot of repetition. And I've known grad students who think, I only need to do this experiment once. And I would say wrong, because if you can't repeat your own experiment, you can't expect it to be published or for somebody else out there to repeat your experiment either. And if somebody else can't repeat your experiment, it's going to be to the detriment of your own career. So let's get into the key topics that I've got outlined for today and how you progress in research or make progress in research, depending on how you want to use that, how you say the word. Okay, so for today, I've got sort of five key points that I want to touch on. And the first one I've kind of already mentioned, and that's repetition. And typically, you are going to repeat your experiments again and again and again. And that can seem like insanity. That can seem like overkill or like, what's the point? But you need to prove that you are a master of the protocol that you're going to write about or describe for your thesis. And so you need to be an expert, and that means, you need to repeat the exercise multiple times. And also by repeating it, if you make minor changes, either in your technique or in the protocol, you're going to get different results. And it's important to recognize, like, oh, okay, if I skip this step or if I rearrange the steps, how does that affect the outcome? And that could end up being very important for your final work, or it may not have much of a consequence at all. But repetition, like it can kind of seem a little bit dull or boring because I'm just doing the same thing over and over again. But there's a point to be made that you need a certain level of expertise to succeed. And that doesn't mean, oh, I proved I could do it once, because that's, basically what you did as an undergrad. And if it was that easy, you wouldn't be a grad student. Somebody else would have already done it, and there'd be no point for you doing it now. And that's the last point on the slide, but it's perhaps the most important one, is if your work was easy, that anybody could do it, then you wouldn't be here. So you need to, realize the importance of, your role in the work. and that it's not meant to be easy. There's going to be a lot of questions that people are going to ask at you. And unless you've done the experiment multiple times, you may not have the answers to some of those questions. Or like if you try to publish a paper and the reviewers say, did you do this? Did you try that? And if the answer is no, well, now you need to go back and repeat your experiments in order to get it published. So it's important to be doing repetitive experiments and collecting that data and storing it. So when the time comes, you can defend your ideas and get your work published. Now, something that I've struggled with, I've seen others struggle with, is the idea of overthinking research. There's a lot of students who might underthink it and just expect it to work, or they don't want to spend time in the literature. And so they just jump in the lab and not quite clear what they're doing or how to get to their result, and they don't think about it much. And then there's other people in more like my boat where I want to read a lot. I want to understand what people have done. I don't want to jump in with both feet because I might be missing something, and I want to make sure that it's worth my time to do the experiment. But that also takes time. And to some extent, you can't plan for every contingency. And so it's important to find this balance between reading the literature, thinking about your work, sketching it out on paper, what you want to do, but then going and trying and then learning as you go. And this is part of the repetition process too, where you can't just plan the perfect experiment because it's not going to work as you expected. There's going to be, something you're going to realize in the lab that you overlooked, or that isn't as quick or simple as you expected, or maybe it's completely different than how you had planned. And I ran into that a lot because I'd be doing experiments on a microscope, and I couldn't always figure out how to do it at the microscope unless I spent an hour or two trying to do it. And I didn't worry about collecting data. I was just, how do I put this on the microscope? How do I get it in focus? How do I time a series of events if I want to capture video? Like, there's, sometimes just doing a mock experiment where you don't expect to collect data. You're just trying to walk through the steps. That's not a bad idea. In fact, I was watching an episode of House MD last night, and that's basically what they did for surgery was, and before doing the real surgery, they did a practice run. So they knew what they had to do and how quickly they had to do it. And they knew where the boundaries were. Like, if this happens, we're going to kill the patient. There's nothing wrong with doing that in the science lab. And I've done that multiple times where I planned, but I couldn't foresee every contingency. And instead of trying to plan more, it was time for me to get in the lab and try it and not worry about the data, not worry about, my time, but just go in there and try to actually see if this protocol works and basically figure out my protocol. That was the point of doing the experiment or spending time in the lab, was figuring out the protocol, not worrying about the results. And then once I've got a protocol lined out, now I can focus more on the results. I know how long things are going to take. I know what kind of problems I might run into. And then you gradually refine that by doing the experiment over and over again. But those two things can, repetition and the overthinking and planning, those can be frustrating parts of research because they can be time consuming, but you can't do research without some of that, because the big thing about research, if it's published, is it needs to be repeatable. And first of all, it needs to be repeatable by you. Something that can also be a little bit frustrating in grad school is having multiple projects to work on. But this is actually a good thing, because let's say you have this project you start in your first year, your first summer, and it's a slog. It's going nowhere. You're not making progress, and you're coming up on some deadlines. Well, that's when it's good to have a second project, because if your main project is not going well for you and you need results by the middle point of your grad school experience, what are you going to talk about in that presentation? Or if you're supposed to go to a conference and, maybe it's 6 or 9 months out and you have nothing to report on, like, well, it's good to have a second project because sometimes, especially if your projects are interrelated, by switching gears once in a while, it can give you sort of perspective on what you're doing right or wrong in the other experiment. But also, if one experiment is just progressing slowly, it's good to have another project that is making progress. Typically, if you have two projects, one is going to be something that you should get results on kind of quickly once you get the protocol worked out. And the other one is probably going to be something you're going to be working on much longer and has a little more uncertainty in it. And so it's important to not be afraid to take on two projects. But on the flip side, I wouldn't take on five projects. That would just be maybe way too many. Even if some of those projects you're just sort of tertiary or just kind of maybe doing some very simple testing for somebody. You need to kind of know, like, how much time can I devote to each project, because your primary project or two primary projects, that's where the majority of your time needs to be spent. And so it doesn't hurt to collaborate with others or to chime in to help others a little bit, but you also need to be guarded about your projects. And don't be surprised if you're handed multiple projects, and just, you need to figure out how to make progress on all of them. And if you're having trouble with that, that's when you should be talking to your supervisor and saying, hey, this project isn't going anywhere, or this project is going somewhere. Like, can I change my focus? Or, what can I do to balance so I can meet these deadlines? And, that's part of the conversation you have with your supervisor, as far as like, how do you manage your main project or projects as it may be? And if you're not making progress, sooner or later, your supervisor will sit you down. And where I went to grad school, this happened, I think, to everybody at some point. And we refer to it as the come to Jesus moment, or the come to Jesus conversation, where our supervisor would, we'd be sitting in the office, and it was sort of one of these, like, why are you here? Why do you want to get your degree? Like, what are you going to do to get this project finished? Or how are you going to, meet this deadline? And it's not, a pleasurable conversation to have. But I think we all had some kind of form of that conversation where basically, the supervisor wants to see you make progress and wants to see you succeed, but maybe you're not putting in the best effort, or maybe you're distracted by activities outside of research, whether it's, social activities, whether it's hobbies, whether you're only, you're rolling in the lab late, you're, leaving early, you're not really in the lab, your supervisor doesn't know what's going on, maybe you're not giving any information. And that's when you get pulled aside and you're asked, like, what's going on with you? And it's at a moment like that where you decide, either I need to start being more dedicated and I need to get these experiments done and I need to really focus, or why am I in grad school? And I've seen most people respond to that conversation as a moment where they realize, yeah, I need to be putting in a better effort, or I need to step it up a little bit. But it's not unusual for other students to say, I'm trying everything I can and I don't know what more I can do. In which case, it can still be a fruitful conversation, because maybe that conversation leads to some new insight from your supervisor. So all of these can be, all these bullet points today are kind of keys, as far as, research is frustrating and it can seem like you're not making progress. It's easy to look at other people with envy and be like, oh, they got a paper already, or they're ahead of me by a mile. And, there's moments of successes, there's moments of setbacks. And it's important to kind of take that and accept that as part of the grad school experience. And it's important that you work with the people around you in your lab and you're communicating with your supervisors so you are on the track to succeed and that you do get not just to the top of the mountain, but back down again. And so I could talk a lot more about what research is like or what some of the other issues are with being successful at research. And I probably will at some point come back to that. But I would say early on, the first half of grad school, it can seem like, why am I repeating myself? Like, no amount of planning is enough. I'm doing too many things. My supervisor called me out. Like, it can just seem like, well, like this, I'm destined to fail. And it's important to recognize, well, if it was easy, somebody else would have done it already. And so you are being entrusted or being the steward of this project or projects. And it's important for you to figure out how to get through it because grad school really is an experience where you are going to have a series of obstacles thrown at you and you have to figure out how to navigate them and how to overcome them. It's not like putting it's not like doing a puzzle where you know what the picture on the box looks like and you just have to put it together. A lot of times, in grad school, there's going to be missing pieces or you're going to have to make connections and you don't, you have a general idea of what the final product is going to look like, but that's not how it always works out. And so you have to be prepared that what you're envisioning is as your final result may not be how it works out. And you have to go where the research leads you. And so that's kind of this awakening and awareness that comes with grad school and just overcoming obstacles is a big part of that. So I hope today's video was insightful, especially for those of you early in the research process, or those of you who are maybe struggling and thinking like, oh my goodness, like I can't believe this is what research is like for me. Because, what I described is very similar to what most people's experience would be. And I hope that it gives you some comfort, but also some insight on what to expect. So thanks for tuning in today. I'll see you again real soon. Bye.